Before we start, I'd just like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land from which I'm broadcasting. I'd also like to pay my respects to elders past and present. My name is Ashley Davis. Thanks for joining me again in my continuing live stream developing my Kanban board extension for Visual Studio Code. This is the third session. In a moment I'll show you how you can catch up on the other two sessions. And today we're going to be doing some test-driven development of TypeScript code using Jest. In the first session there's a project overview and motivations for doing this project, and I show you the code repo and how to clone the code repo if you want to follow along. In the second session I showed you how to debug a problem with the Visual Studio Code extension. We installed Jest for TypeScript and we got our first test running. And the way we left it last session was that we had a broken test to fix to start with in this session. So that's where we'll be starting from. Before we do that, I'm just going to show you the code repository again. So this is the code repository. It's on my GitHub, Ashley Davis, Taskboard VS Code extension. You can clone it from here. You can download the zip from here. Well, here's the URL you need to clone it if you want to clone it and follow along. I suggest if you want to kind of actually contribute to this open source project, you click on the fork button up here, fork your own copy, clone it locally. You can make edits to that. You can contribute code back to this code repository, and if it's acceptable, I'll merge it in. Just scrolling down here, there's a README here with instructions on how you can get this running from Visual Studio Code. Just to acknowledge where what this builds on, there's a link here to the original code repository, which is like a template VS Code extension that includes a React web view. So that's just in case you want to follow along. Find the code repository, get the code for yourself. If you do want to watch the previous sessions, look up my YouTube. So it's YouTube channel, The Data Wrangler. If you look under playlists here, you'll see the coding live stream taskboard playlist. If you view the full playlist, you can see the first few sessions, or the first couple of sessions. The first one, like I said, it's where I was explaining the, what the project's all about, why I'm doing it, my motivations. We look at the code repo, how to clone it. I show you how to do that using Git. The second live stream, that was where we kind of debugged our first problem with the extension and fixed it. Then we tried to, then we installed Jest for TypeScript and configured it to get it working. And we created our first test. We got that passing. We also created our second test, but we left that failing as a good place to start off from in today's session. Before we get into it properly, I'll just show you what the prototype looks like. So this is the prototype that I created before I started doing the live streaming. I was tweeting about this before I was live streaming about it. But this is a Kanban board that's rendered or displayed in Visual Studio Code. And it links up to whatever markdown file you've currently got open. And you can edit it. So you can take a task and you can drag it. And you can see over here on the left that that's actually changed the position of the task in the markdown file. So this is just a prototype, real hack and slash code. I just wanted to prove to myself that this project was feasible. Obviously, I'm not building this UI. This UI is already built. It's called React Trello. I'll just show you that. So fortunately for me, there's this already this brilliant open source project called React Trello that gives you the whole kind of Trello style Kanban board. So I didn't have to make that. I may have to make a few changes to it. That'll be a future live stream. If I have to update this and submit a pull request, that'll be an interesting live stream for you to see how that's done. But the real problem here is, how do I convert Markdown to Kanban board data? And I roughly prototyped that function. I'll quickly show you what that looks like. Here I am in the actual Visual Studio Code project for this extension. And there's a function here somewhere. Actually, wrong file. It's in the React part of the app. So if I just drill down into the React part of the app, we've got, so Markdown to board. So this is a function that I prototyped that will convert the markdown file to Kanban board data that can be displayed in React Trello. Now this is the function that I'm trying to rewrite using test-driven development. And the reason for that is because, you know, like I put this together pretty quickly. You know, I think there's probably going to be problems with it because it's converting one complicated format to another. You know, there's maybe edge cases that I've missed. There's probably failure modes that I've missed. And I'd like to do TDD to make sure that I've covered that properly. And then leading on from that, probably in the next live stream, I want to basically be able to kind of convert a markdown to Kanban board data. And then when the Kanban board is edited, to be able to wire those changes back into the markdown abstract syntax tree. So I want to do that so that I can preserve data in the markdown file that doesn't conform to the Kanban board format, because, you know, like the markdown format is fairly general. And if the users of this extension put stuff in there that doesn't fit, I don't want the Kanban board to touch that. I just want them to preserve it. If the Kanban board overwrote that and deleted some of the data, you know, that wouldn't be a good user experience. So that's what I'm aiming to avoid. And there's going to be complexity in that. It's going to get complex, and that's why test-driven development is going to be really good, because it's going to really help me manage that complexity. It's going to allow me to manage all the complex edge cases, and I can keep adding. I can keep adding complexity to it, and I won't break it. At least I won't break anything that I've previously had working, because my tests will fail, and they'll tell me if it's broken. So that's why I'm doing test-driven development of this. Now, let's have a look at. I might just close some of this down so we've seen that. I don't need that open now. Just minimize that. Okay, so here we are at the terminal in my Taskboard directory. You can see I've got 3 copies of the code repository here. There's like the original one that I just use as a clean copy. There was the original working one from the second session. No, sorry, that was from the first session where I demonstrated how to clone it. And I completely, at the end of that session, I completely failed to get Jest working. So I just left that as it was. Because I had to actually, offline I'd got Jest working in that repo. But then because I wanted to demonstrate how to get Jest working, I cloned it again. So that's why I've ended up with this working 2 directory, which is what I'm going to go into now. And you might be wondering why I'm using Linux or Unix commands here. It's because I've got git bash installed under Windows 10, which gives you a bunch of really, really convenient Linux commands, which means I don't really have to care, you know, whether I'm working on Mac OS, Windows, or Ubuntu Linux. Ubuntu Linux is what I use regularly for development as well. And I can just use the same commands on each system. Now what I'm going to do here, I'm just going to open Visual Studio Code on this directory first so that we've got that. Hang on, it's just come up off screen. Let me pull it back. Where are you? There you are. Now, actually, but before we start getting back into the testing, I just want to work through one little problem that we've got in the configuration that I didn't think of last time, and then I discovered in between the live streams. If I run this at the moment, I can run npm test. As we expect from the last session, we should have a failing test, and that is the test that I aim to get working in this session. So yep, you can see here there's one failed test. There's 2 total tests. So the original test from last session is passing. The last test we did is failing, and that's because we're going to do it in this session. Now, because this is a TypeScript project, I can actually just run the Typescript Compiler from the command line here and build it. But this actually causes an odd little problem that we should fix. Now, the TypeScript code gets compiled to this out directory. That's the way this is configured. So you can see the JavaScript files here that have been generated. But this really confuses Jest. So if I run the test again, what we're going to see now is we're going to see 2 failed tests. So see here we've got 2 failed tests. How did this suddenly jump from 1 failed test to 2 failed tests? What happened? If you look back to the test that actually fails, I mean, you can see this one here. This is the source test converter test.ts. But going back a bit, there's the same file here, or it's the JavaScript compiled version in the out directory. So we're actually running tests both on our TypeScript and our compiled JavaScript, which is going to lead to some confusion. But what we can do to fix this is to configure Jest to ignore the out directory. And I've got an example of how to do that here somewhere. So often when you're doing these sort of complex configurations, the best way to integrate these things into your project is to look at a simple test project or a simple example that is working, compare the differences, and then copy the differences over. And I just happen to, in my GitHub, I just happen to have this TypeScript template, which is a great starting point for any TypeScript project. But because I started this extension project from someone else's repository and not one of my templates, it doesn't have all this configuration pre-made. But what I'm looking here is for the Jest config file. I'm just going to open that in a separate tab. And this is what I'm looking for here, the configuration in there to ignore a particular directory. So I'm just going to copy that out. I'm going to move that over to my Jest configuration file here. Let's see what that does. Go back to the code, run the test again. So there's still two failed tests, and this is just a classic copy and paste error because normally when I'm building a TypeScript project, I have it configured to output the compiled JavaScript to a build directory. But with this project that I'm building on top of, it was already configured to output to an out directory. So I just have to change that. I'll save that, and hopefully this time when I run the test, I'm just going to get the one failed test, which is what I want. Okay, fantastic. So I'm going to commit that. I'll go and have a look in source tree here at what the change was. You can see over here what I've changed. It's always a good idea to just diff your changes. If you're not using source tree, you can actually do this from the command line as well with a git diff, and that shows you what you've added, what you've changed. It's a good idea just to check that, just to like make sure you're not testing any kind of debugging code or problems, or it's kind of like a code review, but you're code reviewing yourself. So I could stage that here. I could commit it here from source tree, but I'm going to do it from the command line. Let's just see what's there. Add the updated file to work. You can go back to source tree, and if I refresh this, oh, I've accidentally committed everything. Did I? Oh, I put the dot there. That was a mistype. Let's start this again. Unstage all. Git add jest config.ts. So if I do a git status again now, it should show me that I've staged that. I've got some unstaged changes there. I can check it in source tree. So you can see that this change here is now staged for commit. I'll just commit that. Again, I could commit this from source tree. I usually do. I don't often use the command line. I usually use the GUI. Using the GUI is fine, but I'm trying to show people how to use Git as well, so let's just use it from the command line. So this is Jest configuration change to ignore. What are we doing again? To ignore the TypeScript output directory. Always good to use good commit messages, because when you're looking back over this, it's like your journal of what you did, and sometimes you have to look back over this and find out why you did something and what you were doing, and it's really useful just to kind of document your work. So I'm just going to push that up. So this will be available. This change it's going up to GitHub now. So if you are following along, you can literally pull that change. Okay, so let's do some TDD. Last session I added the test watch script, which allows me to run Jest in watch mode, or what I like to call live reload mode. So I can do coding and have this automatically update while I'm coding. So this should give me my failed test, which I'm going to try and fix now and have a passing test. Now, before we do that, what are we going to look at next? So just going to show you the function we're testing. So I've created a new function. It should be in the React app. I'll eventually move it there, but for the moment I'm just TDDing this in the extension code itself. So we've got this converter.ts file. We've got a function here, markdown abstract syntax tree to board data. It's taking the markdown AST. That's the data structure, basically that's the in-memory data structure that represents the parsed markdown file. It's going to return board data. We haven't even fleshed out board data yet. This interface is empty. We are returning an empty object. Let's have a quick look at the tests where we got to. So the first test here is that we can load an empty board. So if we're passing in an empty AST into the function here, and we're getting back the board data, we're expecting the board data to be an empty object. So that passes, that's okay, because that's exactly what this function is doing. All it's doing at the moment is returning an empty object. I'm taking this real slow, real step by step, because normally I'm one for taking shortcuts, and but I'm really trying to do a real kind of step by step, slow, by the book TDD process here. Really, it's just for demonstration. I do kind of work like this, actually. I do kind of work like this, but I'm also able to take shortcuts when I need to. And when I take shortcuts, I always understand the trade-offs that I'm making and how I can potentially fix problems later that could cause. So the test that we've got, that we implemented the test but we haven't got it to pass, is this one here, can load column. So I started this test by basically synthesizing some markdown AST. So we generate this. I generated this using the remark parser. So I was able to kind of load, a markdown file. I'll actually show you that. I'll show you the entire AST that I generated. Hopefully I've still got it here. There it is. So but essentially I just had like a little Node.js program that would parse the markdown file, save this AST as a JSON file, and then to do the testing now I can actually pull out parts of this AST JSON data. I can pull them out and actually put them in the test file. So that's what I've done here. I've got this small, it's fairly small snippet of JavaScript data here that was actually just literally loaded from, or it's an extract from that JSON file. I'm going to collapse that whole thing so it just doesn't get in the way. So we've got our test data. We're passing our test data. We're getting our board data in. What we're expecting back here is a board object with lanes. So that's an array of objects. It's going to have one lane, and the title of it is going to be to do. It's got no cards. So this is just that we can load a column, or in the board data it's called a lane. But in my parlance I call it a column, like a column in a Trello board basically. Down here we've got some ideas. I like to kind of keep a running list of ideas of things that we're going to test. And now I'm going to try and get this test to work. Now the way I like to work, it's a little bit hard on a laptop. This is easier on a desktop where you've got more screen real estate, is to put your tests and your code side by side. So the question is how do I get this? Now the answer to this is kind of silly actually. It's literally like with TDD, the by the book TDD is do the simplest thing that makes the test pass. And in this case, I don't even think I necessarily agree that this is the right way to do it. But let's just see how this works out. So you could do something like, let's just try returning that object directly. Like I could literally just copy and paste what the test is expecting into here. That didn't kind of work the way I wanted. Let's just get rid of that empty object there. Okay, let's tidy this up. This should make my test pass, right? Ah, well, I'm actually in a worse situation. I've got two failing tests now. I expected my my original test to fail, the can load empty board. Of course, that's going to fail because it's expecting an empty object, and now it's getting this hard-coded object here. And I expected I expected this one to pass. Can load a column. Like, why is that not passing? There's something a little bit strange about that. Oh, I've literally just taken that small snippet of it, and what I needed to do was actually take this whole entire thing here. So I'm actually returning the entire board data. So now you can see we have got only one failed test, and it's our first test. We've failed the can load an empty board. We can no longer load an empty board. But funnily enough, even though we completely cheated, we are passing this can load a column test. So I need to get both my tests passing. And I can do that just by saying if this is, I don't know if this is going to work, but let's just see. If that is an empty object, return an empty object. Otherwise, we return what the other test is expecting. Is this going to work? Is this going to give us two passing tests? I'm not sure. No, because I don't think this test, I think that's going to be testing like object identity, which obviously isn't going to work. But let's just say if it's got no keys, this is just a complete hack, but you know, we'll fix this in a minute. If it has no properties, it's empty. Just to make a point. Okay, cool, we've got two passing tests. You know, obviously this is not correct. This is not exactly useful code. But we are sort of following the rules of test-driven development here, in that you do the simplest thing that you know makes your tests pass. And of course now, what I'm going to do, I could just go and write this properly to return the proper thing. But what I'm going to do is, I'm going to force that to happen through a test. Let's just say that we've got a copy of this. Can load a column with different data. So we're loading a column that's got blah as the value, and we're expecting blah in the title and blah in the ID. Now, it's always good before you get the result to predict what you're going to get. I predict I'm going to get two passing tests, one failed tests. Yep. So my new test fails. It's nice to do these predictions, so it's like it kind of starts tuning your mind for development. It's like, you know, like I predict this is what's going to happen, and then if it gives you the wrong answer or the different answer to what you expected, you know that you've got to kind of adjust your mind. You know, somehow you were thinking about this in the wrong way. But my prediction was right. I have one failing test, and that's because my code's just not very interesting here. It's just returning this one thing that's hard coded to return this. But what I want to do now is I actually want to make this kind of dive down and pull out this object. Now, to remember how to do this, I can actually go back to my original code, my original prototype, which is buried down here. So this is the advantage of doing a prototype, is that it's not, you know, the prototype I did wasn't test driven. I just hacked and slashed code to figure out what I was doing. But now I've got like a recipe almost that I can come back and I can look at, and I can fit this in. Now what I'm looking for here is I'm looking for one child of my AST. That child has got to have a heading. And we don't even need to test for that at the moment, I don't think. But I think I will. I think I just need to do that, even though I'm not explicitly testing for that. And then it's got to have like a next child that's a list, and then you can pull the board data out of that. But this can be, at the moment, there's no need to load multiple columns. We haven't written a test for that. So what we can do here is we can literally just hard code it to pull that data out. So what do we need here? We need what I'm thinking is going to be the first child. So let's get the first child in the abstract syntax tree. We could test that that's a heading. Actually, let's just assume that that's a heading, and I'll kind of test for that later. We also need this depth to be 3, I think, because I think that's how it tells what a lane heading is. But let's just gloss over that for the moment. And then I also want to get the next child. And I think, is it just the next child that I want? No, it's literally just this first child. So if I say I've got a lane, I don't have I don't have any type definitions for a lane yet, so I'm just going to make that an any in TypeScript, so I can put anything I want in it. I'm going to initialize the title. From the first value of the child. So that is what's going to come through as to do. Later on, I want to make the ID different, and you'll see why later. But for the moment, I'm just going to make that the same thing. That's what my test expects. And crazy enough, this little hack should get my test to pass. I predict that my test will pass. I could be wrong. I could have fucked this up somehow. Yes, I did. I've got 2 failing tests. Why is that? What have I done wrong? Actually, I'm getting a little bit confused. So let's just restart this npm test. Oh, I'm missing the cards. Okay, so this tells me. So this can load a column from different data. It's failing. The other one's failing for the same reason I expect. Yep. So it's telling me this minus symbol here is telling me that it didn't get the cards empty array. So I've forgotten that, and I've forgotten that here as well. So let's just put this back in watch mode. If I add the cards, so my tests here are giving me the guidance. My tests are guiding me on how to get to success. I haven't saved that yet. I'm just running Jest. I should get 2 failed tests. I'll save that. It runs again. This time I predict that I will get all passing tests. That looks pretty good. 3 passing tests. Now, of course, this is hard coded to return a single lane object, and our data can contain multiple lanes. So the next step here, and we've got the actual kind of hint here of what I wanted to do next, can load multiple columns. So let's make a new test for that. Actually, I've already done that. What do I need is an it, and I'll copy this, move this test name up here. Now I need some test data again. So I'm just going to copy that AST in here. What I need this time though is I want to have a whole other column, which basically means I want a whole other heading for the column and a whole other list of tasks that are going to be in it. So all I really need to do, I think, let's just make this data a little bit simpler as well. Like the markdown parser adds this position information that shows you the position in the markdown where it comes from. I don't think I need that in this test. So I can drastically simplify this data just by removing that. I will later on remove that from the other tests as well. But now I'm going to copy this. I'm going to repeat that. So I've got 2 different tasks. Let's call this task 1, and we'll call this task 2. Now my test is going to be basically the same. My test code is basically the same as before, so I will copy that as well. But now what I'm expecting is to have multiple lanes. So I'm gonna copy this lane data here, and I'm going to say this one is task 1, This one is going to be task 2. Now, if all is going correctly, this should give me a new failing test that I have to make pass in order to upgrade my code to the next stage. Now, that's cool. It has failed. Did it fail in the way that I expected? Yeah, because task 1 is coming through. We've basically hard-coded to parse that first task, but it's not doing any more after that. So task 2 is not coming through in this test. But all the other 3 tests are still passing. So we've added a test. We haven't broken anything that previously existed. If we had broken anything, we would have other failing tests. So it's pretty simple to get this working. I literally now have to do what my prototype code here was doing. I literally have to have like a for loop or something here that I can use to iterate through all of my all of the children in this AST. Where's the test code gone? Okay. So I'm just going to type that in from scratch. How are we going to do this? I'm doing it by index, and the reason I'm not doing like a for each, not a for each, a for of loop, is that I need to, for every loop iteration, I actually need to look at 2 children. So I'm looking at the child, that is the header, and I'm looking at the child, that is the list of tasks. Okay, so I've got my for loop there. I might just make this a little bit wider, just so we can see what's going on there. We can still kind of see the tests in the background, but we can easily get back to that. So effectively what I want to do at the moment is I want to move this whole thing. Well, I need to have a board data here actually. So I do have a board data type here. But I haven't even fleshed that out yet. So we're going to go and do some TypeScript types for this in a minute. But for the moment, I'm just going to make this an any, just until I can remind myself what's going to actually be in there. So we can get the test passing, and then we can actually do the types. There's no real reason why you have to have types to begin with. You can just treat it just like JavaScript code with no typing, which is really cool. So I've got my board data. I'm going to have some lanes in there, just an empty array to start with. I'm going to pull my lane here. Actually, this for loop is wrong. I can already see it's wrong because with every loop, let me just check what I did in my prototype code. So this is a bit awkward, this code actually, because it's doing like an increment here and it's doing an increment here. That kind of feels wrong to me now. What I'm going to do is I'm just going to do plus equals 2. So every loop iteration we're skipping 2 children. And I don't need the second child yet because I'm only parsing the heading really. I only need to extract the heading. And of course that can't be 0, that has to be child index. Well, I just saved it, so I've triggered my tests, but it's all going to be horribly broken at the moment because of syntax errors and whatnot here. So I'm getting the child at this index in the loop iteration. Now it's underneath that child. We'll call this. Let's call this. Give it a good name rather than just this boring name child. What can we call it? Naming is like the hardest thing in computer programming, thinking of good names. It should be easier, but sometimes it's not. Let's call this column node because it's a column. It's a column in the Kanban board basically. And so we're looking at the text value under there, so that should be correct. That should be what we need. Oh, we've got to add this now. So board data.lanes.push, push the lane into the board data. Let's get rid of all this other garbage here now, and we've got a slightly nicer function. So my anticipation is that this will pass all the tests, but I could have easily written some code here that's going to break a test. So, but let's see. What have I got wrong here? Okay, so interestingly, I've got my 3 latest tests are passing. I can load a column. I can load a column with some different data. I can load multiple columns now. But for some reason, the data we're returning for an empty board is, and I know what this is. Actually, I think it's really a problem with the test. So at this point, what I want to do is I want to update the test, because this empty object here is not a valid representation of an empty board. It should actually be a board with no lanes. So I think that's going to fix this first test. It hasn't yet. What else have I got to do here? Let's actually have a look at the error message we're getting. I'm not really... Okay, look. I'm actually getting an error that I didn't even look at. Cannot read property length of undefined. That's because there's no children. Okay, that's fair enough. So I've updated this test anyway for it to be what I expect. I do expect empty lanes to come through in an empty board. I think that's fine. Now the problem I've got here though is that the input data, so the input data that I'm using here has no children. It's not really a valid abstract syntax tree. I could fix that in the test by making it a valid abstract syntax tree. That's one way of fixing this. Hopefully this will get us a passing test. I'm going to go with that for now. I'm going to assume that the parsing library that I'm using is always going to give me a markdown, an abstract syntax tree that has an empty array for children. Otherwise, what I could do if that wasn't the case, and let's just try that now. So I'll delete that. I'll get my failing test back. I'll go back to here. Otherwise, I'd have to kind of wrap this. Like I could do this. If that is set, then do that. This should get me a passing test. Yep, I've got 4 passing tests. The other way that I could do this, I'm just going to undo that change. A different way that I could do this is to say markdown, this is a bit cunning, markdown children or an empty array. So if markdown ASD children is not set, it's going to give an empty array here, which is going to have length 0, which is going to give me passing tests. But I don't really want to overly complicate my code when I don't have to. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to go back to passing in this empty children. So I'm passing in my test. I'm passing in what I say is a valid AST, and this should give me the passing tests again. Awesome. So let's commit this and push it. I think this is a little bit of progress. I'll go into source tree. I'll do this all from source tree. So I haven't committed any tests yet. This is the first commit of this file. Convert to the test and convert to tests. I'll stage all those. What is this? First tests for my function to convert a markdown abstract syntax tree to Kanban board data. I'll commit that. I've got all the authentication set up to basically push from the terminal. So I'll just push from here. So those code changes are going up to GitHub now. You can go to the repo and you can grab that and you can try these tests for yourself. I'm going to call it a day because ideally I prefer to get through these live stream sessions in 30 minutes and we're a little bit over that now. What we're going to do next session is we're going to finish this up. We're going to be able to load a task. We're going to be able to load multiple tasks. You've seen in this session how that we're following these kind of simple iterative steps of test-driven development, and some of the steps just seem to be too trivial. I'll totally agree with you if you think they seem too trivial. But what this has resulted, this step by step, is starting to build a complex function. You can see how this function is getting more complex, and ultimately this function is going to grow to look more like the prototype. So it's going to go and sort of look as complicated as this. Eventually it's going to be probably about doubly as complicated as this, but it'll all be under test. It'll all be under automated test. So if at any point along the way I do something that breaks this code, I'll know about it instantly. So essentially what that means is this code is never going to be broken. No, at least not in ways that I've tested it. Obviously there's ways this code can be broken that I can't even imagine yet. We can talk about that again later. But these tests are going to keep this code in real good working order over the coming weeks as I build this out, and I make it be able to kind of, like I said earlier on, to preserve the user data that's in the markdown file, because we don't want to lose that data. So coming up in the next session, we're going to be finishing these tests. We're going to be basically finishing the basic version of this function. And then then probably in the session after that, we're going to come back and we're going to look at some functional JavaScript coding. Well, we'll be doing it in TypeScript, but I mean, you get the picture. You can apply anything you can apply to JavaScript. You can basically apply to TypeScript as well. So we're going to be looking at some functional coding for JavaScript. Specifically, I'm interested in the library called Ramda, and how we can use the Ramda path function to basically as an identifier of a node in an abstract syntax tree. So this is how I want to basically have a reference from like a Kanban board lane or a Kanban board task back into a particular node in the abstract syntax tree. So when the board changes, we can just wire that update into the AST, reserialize it to Markdown, and we won't lose any user data. I'm also wanting to look at, there's a few different JavaScript functional programming libraries that I'm having a play with and I'm looking at. I don't know if it's going to come to fruition yet, but I want to show how you can potentially improve the semantics of the function we're working on. Let me just go back to that for a second. I want to be able to improve I'm hoping to make this function more elegant is what I'm saying. Like I said, this is going to grow more complicated. It's going to look a bit more like this prototype. It's going to get way more complicated than that actually once I have the data preservation in there. So I'd like to try and experiment with functional programming JavaScript for tree traversal and pattern matching, so that we can find a more elegant way of pulling out the data out of this tree to convert it to Kanban board data. But that's it for today. Thanks so much for joining me, and I'll see you again in a week. Bye-bye.